All right, what we're going to do now is in our solarcoffee.web project, we'll head down into our startup class, and then we're going to make some changes to our configure services method to actually set up our DB context that we've been working on in the data layer to connect to the Postgres database that we'd like to use for this particular project. So we already have services.addControllers in our configure services method, and now what I'm going to do is add a line here for services.addDBContext, and we'll need to actually provide our SolarDB context here as the type. We'll have to make some imports here. So first of all, we can reference solarcoffee.data and use solarcoffee.data.solardbcontext. If you don't have the key binding there to do that, then if we right click on the project here, we should be able to add a reference. So we'll click add a reference, and we're essentially referencing our data project so that it's accessible within the web project here. I'm just going to use the key binding here. And now we also need to specify some options here, for instance, our connection strings. And this is actually going to be pretty simple. We can use a lambda here, and so we'll just call it opts, and then on this opts object we have, for instance, enable detailed errors. We'll leave this on for now. That could be potentially useful. And then we're going to say ops.use npg SQL. And this actually takes a configuration, which would be our connection string. And rather than hard code our connection string here in the startup class, we really want to get this from our configuration. And so I'm going to call our connection string here solar.dev. Now, if you recall, a few videos back, we talked about this appsettings.json and appsettings.development.json files. And so what I'm going to do is edit this appsettings.development.json, and we're going to add a key to our JSON file here for connection strings. So go ahead and add that here. We will need to make sure that this is properly formatted as JSON, and I said we'd call this solar.dev. And now we just need to provide a Postgres compatible connection string, and in our case it's going to look like this. We're going to run the database on localhost in dev. The default port for Postgres is 5432. We'll create a couple of extra parameters here in a moment, but let's go ahead and call our username solardev. We'll make the password solar123, and the database we'll call solardev. Oops. And make sure that you have a semicolon here at the end of the connection string. If your connection string doesn't look like this, and if you have a typo somewhere or you're missing things like semicolons, then you will have trouble connecting to your Postgres instance. Okay, so we have this key connection strings. We've got a key and an object under that called solar.dev. And so when we're calling configuration.getConnectionString, that's actually just going to look for a key called connection strings and then look for the solar.dev key here, and it will resolve to the connection string that we have here. So now I'm going to open up a terminal and use the pSQL CLI tool to actually generate a user and a password and the database solardev. So let's go ahead and do that. So our web server isn't running, and I'm going to run the command pSQL here. And now we're going to create a new user on our Postgres database. You may be connected to your Postgres instance with a different username. It might be Postgres, or it might be whatever you have currently set up. we're just going to run a command to actually create a new user that corresponds to the user that our connection string is expecting here, which is this SolarDev user with password solar123. And the command that we'll run for that is create user SolarDev with password SolarDev123, or I think I called it Solar123. And then a semicolon here, and then the output we'll get is create role. And then what we're going to do is create database, and I called our database SolarDev. And you can see the output we get is create database. And then I'm going to run the command grant all privileges on database SolarDev to user SolarDev. Oops, and it's not to user, it's to SolarDev. Okay, so grant all privileges on database SolarDev to SolarDev. Now we can actually change users from whatever user you're currently on to SolarDev with the shortcut \C, and I'm going to say SolarDev and then space SolarDev. So this is saying change to the database SolarDev as user SolarDev. And it should say you're now connected to the database SolarDev as user SolarDev. Okay, if that's working, then we're actually ready to take the next step, which is to start connecting our web application to the database that we just created. So I'm going to head back over here. I also realized that my text is quite small, so I'm going to bump the size up here. Okay, and let's head back into our startup class. So we should have this add DB context of type SolarDB context with the options configured to enable detailed errors and to use Postgres here via the use npg SQL. So what we're going to do now is, first of all, we can disconnect from our database with Control-D here or \Q. And now I'm going to run some Entity Framework commands to actually create our first migration. And while we're in the project, we need to go ahead and add some more NuGet packages here to enable Entity Framework to work with migrations to our database. So what we need to do is look for a NuGet package called Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.design. And I'm going to go ahead and add this to our project. Again, if you're working from the terminal, just follow the instructions for using the .NET command to install NuGet packages that you can find on NuGet.org. I'm also going to add Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.tools.